Hello, everyone. As people come in, we will give some time for people to get acclimated to their computers, and then we will start in just one moment. Okay, we are at, okay. So, hello, everyone, and welcome to our viewers from around the world. Thank you all for participating in this webinar on improving economic conditions for African youth. This webinar is being organized by Afrobarometer and the Think Africa Partnerships Economists for Transformation program. We are streaming live on YouTube and providing live updates on social media channels. Participants are encouraged to share widely using the hashtags on the screen and tagging Afrobarometer and World Bank Africa. There's live translations in English and French, and participants should click on the globe icon and choose their preferred language. S'il vous plaît, mon français n'est pas parfait, mais si vous préférez le français, il y a un icône en bas de votre écran sur le globe, le monde. Et s'il vous plaît, cliquez le globe pour le langage préféré. We would like to thank our speakers for coming, and we would also like to thank the participants for coming. We also would like to recognize that there are different time zones, and we really appreciate you making the effort to come here, regardless of the time it is. We hope you all have a good time in this webinar, and we want to let you know that this is important because unemployment is a major issue in the African continent. It is one of the highly topped issues that Afrobarometer has notified the governments about since they've started polling this. The unemployment issue has been growing amongst youth, and they feel as though it is a pressing issue that is not being addressed very well. When we invest in the youth, we invest in society and the future. When Africa wins, we all win. And with that, we will start. Today we have uh, Mrs. Amina Oyagbola, and she is an independent director in business management consulting with more than 35 years of experience. She is the managing consultant for AKMS Consulting and a senior partner of Oyagbola Chambers and a Chevening Scholar. In 2023, she was appointed to Nigeria's Presidential Council on supporting women and girls, and one of several honors recognizing her contributions to gender equality and women's empowerment. With that, we hand it over to Mrs. Amina Oyagbola.
Thank you very much. And my proudest accolade is that I'm chair of Afrobarometer, and it's in that capacity that I'm here this afternoon. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're logging in from. Distinguished guests, partners, colleagues, and my co-panelists, and especially the young people joining us today from wherever you are across the continent and beyond. On behalf of Afrobarometer and the Think Africa Partnerships Evidence for Transformation program, it is indeed my great pleasure and singular honor to welcome you to this very timely and important conversation on improving economic conditions for Africa's youth. Thank you for making time to be with us today. As you know, Afrobarometer has spent the past 26 years listening carefully to the voices of African citizens. Our mandate is very clear: to ensure that the values, evaluations, and experiences of Africans, particularly young Africans, inform policy and decision-making at every level. With youth making up more than 60% of the African continent's population, Their economic realities are the foundation upon which Africa's future will be built. Today's dialogue, therefore, could not be more urgent. Across the continent, young people are navigating persistent unemployment, underemployment, and limited opportunities for upward mobility. Afrobarometer data show that Africa's driving force, its young and well-educated children, are increasingly expressing a desire to migrate in search of better prospects and opportunities. This signals not a lack of commitment to their countries or indeed to the continent, but a deep-seated frustration with the economic constraints that they face. At the same time, we see remarkable resilience, innovation, energy, and determination among Africa's young people. They are building businesses, driving digital transformation, contributing to climate solutions, and reshaping civic and political spaces. Their energy is a resource that we cannot afford to waste. This webinar, therefore, offers us an opportunity to examine the data, hear directly from practitioners and young economists, and reflect together on what it will take to create the enabling environment that our youth deserve. We need policies that not only respond to the challenges, but also unlock the tremendous economic potential young people carry. I would like to thank our partners at the Think Africa Partnership's E4T program for their collaboration, our distinguished panelists for making time to come here today to share their expertise and their experiences, and all participants for coming to contribute to this very important discussion and conversation. I look forward with great excitement to the exchanges ahead. And I want to thank you most sincerely once again for granting me this opportunity to speak with you. And again, I extend a very, very warm welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those beautiful remarks from Mrs. Oyakbola. Next up, we have Mr. James Cust, a senior economist in the Office of the Chief Economist, Africa region of the World Bank. He co-founded and manages the World Bank's Think Africa program partnership, flagship multi-donor trust fund that supports economic transformation and growth across the African continent by promoting research uptake in policymaking.
Thanks very much. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're joining us from. So it's a great pleasure to be here today, and thanks to everyone for connecting and to our partners at Afrobarometer and our panelists. We've got a really exciting program for you today. So to kick things off, I'm going to give you a little bit more background on the Economists for Transformation Network and some data from the World Bank to motivate some of the conversation we're going to have today. So let me share my screen. Um, yeah, I hope that is showing up. So just for those of you who are not familiar with the Economists for Transformation Network, this is an initiative from the World Bank to support a community of young professionals engaged and interested in economic policy topics in sub-Saharan Africa. It's already a big and growing cohort of peers. We convene and share resources so that you can come together to exchange ideas and opportunities, job opportunities. There are many different fellowships that we're able to highlight through the network, and members in the network circulate opportunities of interest to one another. And of course, we organize webinars and other events of this nature, like today with our partners at Afrobarometer. So we hope that you will find today's event interesting and come back for more. So if you are interested in staying in touch, you can follow the LinkedIn page. The QR code that I'm showing now will take you directly there. We also have a private members discussion group. So once you follow the LinkedIn page, we can invite you to join the discussion group where you can discuss, debate economic policy issues in Africa among your peers. Now, just as a little bit of introduction, I want to share some data from the World Bank. So our office, the Chief Economist Office for the Africa region, produces a publication called Africa's Pulse every 6 months. And this is really taking of the pulse of the economic conditions across sub-Saharan Africa to update our understanding about where the data is pointing. So I want to give you just a few highlights from the most recent October edition to set the stage for the conversation that we're having today. So the first thing to say is that there's some more optimistic news on the horizon. We see a recovery in growth from the lows in 2023 up through 2024, and actually projecting higher growth in the next couple of years for the regional averages. And that's matched by 30 of 47 countries have actually revised upwards their growth forecast. So this is very positive news given the global conditions, the global uncertainty, and very challenging headwinds that we're seeing internationally. But of course, it's not all good news. One of the topics that we're following very closely is the debt burden carried in the region by many countries. This chart depicts the evolution of the interest rates of different debt instruments and how they've been changing over time. And you'll see for some of these, like domestic bonds, the effective interest rate has actually been rising quite strongly over the last 25 years. For others, like concessional finance, interest rates remain very low. But of course, the challenge has been the composition of debt that governments are holding has become increasingly non-concessional and therefore more commercial. And it's the commercial debt that has become very costly in recent years and remaining so while we still have a higher interest rate environment. So, of course, this has a lot of implications for how much room for maneuver governments have to engage in different programs to support job creation and development. And finally, a cautionary note, which is while we do see robust growth recovery, this hasn't always translated, as we know, into meaningful poverty reduction. And of course, job creation, job opportunities are a major transmission mechanism by which GDP growth can actually help alleviate the poverty conditions of many people in the region. And if we look ahead, we see quite worrying trends. So given the huge sort of demographic trends in the region, business as usual, unfortunately, will not see extreme poverty coming down at the pace we would like to see. And actually, in absolute numbers, we could actually see increases in extreme poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. So this, as we know, is a huge challenge. We all face, all of those of us working in the region. And business as usual is not going to cut it. And so I really want to begin today's conversation with this challenge to us all of bringing new ideas to the table, challenging the status quo, and seeing how we can break this trend. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Cuss, for sharing those opportunities and giving us insights into the World Bank data. And next up, we have Ms. Josephine Sané, who is the Director of Communications at Afrobarometer. She is a bilingual strategic communications expert with extensive experience leading communication initiatives across the African continent. She has authored extensively on economic conditions, youth aspirations, migration, media freedom, violent extremism, democracy, and public service delivery.
Thanks, Nigeria. Hi, everyone. Happy to join you. And I'm going to be sharing Afrobarometer's latest data that we've gathered between 2024 and 2025 from about 38 African countries. My colleague is going to share the screen. Shannon, you're sharing your entire screen. So while we wait for the screen to come on, maybe I should tell you a little bit about Afrobarometer and what we do. We're a non-partisan Pan-African survey network. And basically what we do is to provide reliable data on Africans' experiences, evaluations, of democracy governance, but basically the quality of their lives. The reason why we do this is to ensure that the voices of ordinary Africans reflect when important policies are being made. We've done this since 1999, and so we have a wealth of data from about 45 countries, 45 African countries over the past 26 years. We just recently completed our 10th round of surveys, and we are already preparing for our 11th round, which we hope to begin by the first quarter of 2026. Kindly move to the next slide where we show the footprint of where Afrobarometer has been over the past 26 years. The area shaded gray are the countries where we've not been able to conduct surveys yet, and it's usually maybe due to a host of reasons, including the political stability of the country, but also technical issues like the availability of reliable census data. Because in every country where we work with the National Statistical Service. They help us draw the sample so that it reflects, we say that our samples are nationally representative, and we speak to adult citizens who are 18 years and above. We make sure that it reflects the rural-urban divide and also the regional divide. We conduct face-to-face surveys in the language of the respondent's choice, and we have standard questionnaires that allow us to compare our responses across countries, and we'll be seeing some of the cross-country comparisons in my presentation. Our sample sizes are 1,200 or 2,400, and they yield country-level margins of errors, results with margins of errors of about plus or minus 2 or 3 percentage points. Next slide, please. Now let's dig into the findings. So on policy priorities, we usually ask our citizens to tell us what they think the most important problem is that they want their governments to resolve. And for the first time in this round, we saw that health had risen to the first position, pushing unemployment, which usually ranks first, to the second position. So it's the three top problems for Africans are health, unemployment, and education. Next slide. But when we break it down according to age, we see that unemployment is still a very important problem for young adults. And so you see that it's the proportion of young adults, those aged between 18 to 35, who cite unemployment as their most important problem. It's really close to those who also cite health. But if you look at unemployment alone, then you see a wide gap between those aged 18 to 35 and those aged 56 years and above. Next slide, please. Now, we also compare this according to the rural-urban divide. And here we see that urban citizens are far more likely than the rural folk to cite unemployment as their most important problems. More rural citizens would cite health as the most important issue. Next slide. But then when we look at this from a gender lens, we see that there really isn't much difference when it comes to the views of men and women. Men and women share identical views when it comes to what they see to be the most important problem that they want their governments to urgently address. Next slide, please. And we're going to look at unemployment cited as the most important problem and break it down according to countries. And here we see that in about 8 out of the 38 countries that we surveyed in 2024 and 2025, unemployment is cited by more than half of the citizens as their most important issue. Also, unemployment is the #1 priority in about 14 countries. So you see the countries where we have the 3 asterisks, it means that unemployment came on top as the most important problem, even though on average, we saw that health was the most important problem. When you break it down according to countries, then the priorities sort of vary. Next slide. Now we're also going to talk about employment status. And so we usually ask citizens to tell us if they're employed, whether it's full-time or part-time, or whether they are unemployed and looking for jobs. And the only countries where we have more than half of citizens reporting being employed are Mauritius, Seychelles, and Ghana. Citizens are most likely to be unemployed in countries like Malawi, Benin, and Mali. So they have the lowest employment rates. Now let's look at views on the economic conditions and the people's personal living conditions. Here we're seeing that on average across the 38 African countries, about 59%, so about 6 in 10 Africans say that their country's economic conditions are either fairly bad or very bad. And these negative views are almost unanimous in Nigeria and Eswatini. When we look at the views on the personal living conditions on the next slide, we see similar trends. So about half of citizens also hold very gloomy views of their personal living conditions. And in countries like Nigeria, again, and Lesotho, we have about 3/4 of citizens saying that their personal living conditions are either very bad or fairly bad. Now let's look at what citizens feel, breaking it down according to various, demographic groups. And it's really not surprising that the negative assessments of the country's economic and personal living conditions increase sharply with the citizens' experience with poverty. And then, so here we see that those who are best off, compared to the wealthiest citizens, the poorest citizens are more likely to say that their country's economic conditions or their personal living conditions are bad. But other demographic groups also differ quite modestly when it comes to their views on the country's economic conditions. But it's fine. I was going to talk about the age, but we'll come back to that. Now we're moving on to the trends. And I think this is probably my favorite slide. So you see here that over the past decade, when you look at the trends from 2014 to 2015, up until 2021 and 2023, there's been a steady increase in the proportion, the negative views of the economic conditions and also the negative views of the personal living conditions. The proportion was saying that their country's economic conditions are bad and that their personal living conditions are bad, increased, steadily between 2014 to 2021, 2023. But in our most recent round of surveys, we've seen a decline in the negative views. And I'm hoping that that negative decline sort of holds steady in our next rounds. Next slide. Now we have about close to about 51% of citizens saying that their country's economic conditions have gotten worse, if they compare to previous months. And, negative sentiments, again, Nigeria stands out. So about 9 in 10 Nigerians are saying that their country's economic conditions have gotten worse compared to the previous 12 months. Next slide. But then if you look at their views on how they think the economic conditions are going to be in future, in the next 12 months, then also a similar proportion. So another half are quite optimistic that things will get better in the next 12 months. Next slide. Now we're also going to look at deprivation of basic necessities. So we usually measure how often citizens say they went without 5 key necessities. That's cash income, medical care, water, food, and cooking fuel. And we have about 8 in 10 Africans saying that they went without cash income at least once during the previous month. And then it's followed by deprivation of medical care, which is about 2/3, that's 65%. And then we have 58% saying that they went without enough food at least once. And then 57% saying they went without clean water, and another 53% saying they went without cooking fuel. So majorities of Africans say that they went without each of these basic necessities at least once during the previous year. Next slide. Now, when you look at the deprivation of the basic necessities over time, consistently over the past decade, you see that there's been a consistent increase. And the highest increase is recorded in the lack of medical care. And remember that now the most important problem for Africans is healthcare. And here we are seeing that the proportion of Africans over the past decade who say that they went without medical care at least once during the previous year has increased from 50% to 64% in both 2021, 2023, and in our most recent round of survey. And then the lack of cash income has also been consistently high at about 8 in 10 since the past decade. So here we are looking at lived poverty, and we usually measure citizens' experience with poverty by looking at how often they went without the basic necessities that we talked about. And here we have about 6 in 10 citizens experiencing some level of poverty, either moderate lived poverty or high lived poverty. Only one African is that only 1 in 10 Africans would say that I hope my internet hasn't gone off. Only 1 in 10 Africans would say that they did not lack any of the basic necessities that we talked about in the previous round. Next slide. Over time, okay, let's look at the country breakdowns. And then here we see that across the 38 African countries that we've surveyed, in countries like Chad, Gabon, Madagascar, Nigeria again, Guinea, Congo, Brazzaville, Cameroon, Malawi, Benin, etc., we have about 8 in 10 citizens experiencing either moderate or high lived poverty. But in countries like Seychelles and Mauritius, the experience with poverty is much lower. And remember, when we were talking about employment status, we said that the only countries where majority said they were employed were in Seychelles, Mauritius, and one other country. Next slide. Now, when we look at the experience with poverty over time, here again, we're seeing a steady increase, but between 2021 and 2025, there hasn't been any change so far. Now, let's quickly talk about how citizens perceive government's economic performance. So we're going to look at 5 key indicators of government performance. That's managing the economy, improving the living standards of the poor, creating jobs, narrowing income gaps, and then keeping prices stable. And here, only about 1/3 of Africans think that their governments are doing a good job when it comes to managing the economy. And then far fewer of the citizens are saying I have positive views on. And so just about a quarter are saying the government is doing well in improving the living standards of the poor. Similar proportion are saying same about creating jobs. And then far fewer are giving government good grades when it comes to narrowing income gaps and keeping prices stable. Next slide, please. Now here there's been an interesting trend. So the positive views of government's economic performance, steadily decreased until 2021. And then between 2021, 2023, and the most recent round of surveys, we're seeing an increase. And it's in line with the initial trends that we saw when it comes to the views on the economic conditions and the personal living conditions, the negative views, which increased up to 2021 and is now seeing a modest decline. Next slide. So we're quickly going to talk about migration. The first time we asked this question was in 2016, 2018. And compared to now, the proportion of citizens who have thought of leaving their countries to live in another country, who have given it a thought, at least a lot, somewhat, or a little bit, has increased. So here, on average, we have almost half of citizens saying that they've thought of leaving their countries. But if you compare it to the previous round, there's actually been an increase. Now, the desire to migrate is highest in countries. So those who have thought about it a lot, is highest in Gambia, Liberia, Guinea-Bissau, and Ghana. In Tanzania, Madagascar, Seychelles, very few citizens have given it some thought. Next slide. Who wants to migrate? Now, the graph here is showing us two very important things. And I think Aboche said that in her speech, that Africa's driving force, which is the youngest people and the most educated people, are the ones and so if you look at the patients, those age 56 years and above who have sort of migration. Also, the desire to migrate sort of increases with one's level of education. And so if you compare those with post-secondary education who've thought of migrating, that's like 56%, to those with no formal education, that's like 33%. You see that it's actually those who are more educated who want to leave. Also, we see that more men, the desire to migrate is higher among men, and it's also higher among urban citizens compared to rural citizens. Next slide. Why do they want to leave? The top two reasons why citizens want to leave their countries to another country is for economic reasons. So one is to find work, better jobs, better work opportunities. And then two is to escape economic hardships or escape poverty or destitution. So this is the end of my presentation. We invite you all to visit our website for more of such insights. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that enriching PowerPoint, where we learned a lot about unemployment and the other factors that lead to migration and how the youth are generally feeling across time. Now, it is time to introduce our panelists for the Q&A section. Here we have Mr. Josue Banga, who is a climate finance specialist in the World Bank Finance Competitive and Innovation Practice. He joined as a young professional in September 2023. Previously, he worked at the Green Climate Fund in South Korea and served as the CEOG for the Fellow for South Africa. He supported the chief economic advisor to the president at the World Bank and the Presidential Climate Finance Task Force on innovative sustainable finance solutions. With us, we also have Sibashle Magadla, who is an economic development specialist and career coach with over a decade of experience spanning the private sector, academia, government, and international development organizations. Her expertise sits at the nexus of labor markets, industrial policy, youth employment, and gender equality. She has successfully brought together business and civil society actors to align on pressing economic issues, and she is a Chevening scholar who brings an interdisciplinary lens to dialogue and engagement. Ms. Sabalhe, is a Chevening Scholar with 2 master's degrees in economics from UCT and SOAS, University of London. With that, we would like to introduce our panelists, and we invite them to tell us more about their background as well.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Nagia. As you said, my name is Josue Banga, climate finance specialist at the World Bank. Just a minor correction. So I was a CAG fellow, not for the president of the World Bank, but for the president of the chief economic advisor of the president of South Africa, where I was advising the chief economic advisor on innovative, sustainable finance solutions. And it is a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much to the organizer for putting together just a very interesting and nice event. And I very much look forward to the conversation.
Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, everyone. As mentioned, I'm a development economist who's passionate about promoting job creation on the African continent, particularly for youth. What was not mentioned is that I'm also a career coach. So being exposed to how labor markets are changing and industries are shifting on the African continent, there's a consequence for how young people position their skills to get employed. So what I do as a career coach is to really support young people to gain career clarity regarding the opportunities which are available for them in a very fast changing labor market and support them to position themselves accordingly. It's such an honor to be part of this discussion, and I'm looking forward just to give feedback on the presentation provided by Josephine, but also to engage with the rest of the panelists. Thank you so much.
And thank you to our panelists for being here. As we heard from the PowerPoint, a lot of the African population is under the age of 25 and is projected to grow by millions within the next few decades. We would like to hear your thoughts on the findings of this Afrobarometer survey and what conclusions and reflections do you take from them? What missing aspects do you observe, if there are any?
Yeah, thanks. Maybe three things on my side. The first one, I found the result quite insightful. This is something that is very useful for policymakers to help them decide what are the right policies that need to be implemented to create economic opportunity for young Africans. So if you look at the data, I think the message is quite clear. Africans want the government to prioritize investment in health, job creation, education, and I will even add infrastructure. So this is definitely quite important. If you look at the demographic profile of the continent, we know that the median age in Africa is 19. So really, this is a very young continent, right? So, and imagine there are some studies that show that by 2050, 1 in 4 people on the entire earth will be African. So that's about 25% of the world population. So imagine having 25% of the world population young but unhealthy. How can they contribute to economic development? It is just not possible. And if you are a young African born in Africa and you live in Africa, the data we have suggests that you have on average 25,000 days of life. So let me repeat that, 25,000 days of life. And out of these 25,000 days of life, you have about 15,000 days of productive life to contribute to economic development of your country. So how can you do that if you're not in good health? How can you do that if you're not educated? So the central message is clear. African government need to prioritize health, education, and infrastructure. At the same time, I also look at the data, and they're very quite insightful, but I think some of the data need to be taken with caution. For example, I was surprised to see that in countries like Malawi, unemployment was not necessarily reported as one of the most important problems. And yet, over 80% of the people are unemployed. The same issue happened also if you take country like Gabon, for example. You have like over 50%, I think it was around 56% of the people have reported that the current economic conditions are very or fairly good, right? So, and yet, if you look at again the data, over 80% of them have actually experienced moderate to high lived poverty over the past few years. So these are some discrepancies in the data, and maybe Afrobarometer will also help us understand that better. And finally, the data is quite insightful, I will say, but what was missing for me, I would say, is the role of the private sector. We know that the government have a role to play, right? So, and we cannot expect the government to solve all the 10 plus priorities that were mentioned. And the private sector has a key role to play, right? So, and the way I see the role of the government, it's more like, for people who know a beekeeper work. As a beekeeper, your work is to design the beehive, create the structure, how you want the bee to be, the honey to be structured in the beehive, and how you want to collect the honey from the beehive. So it is your role as a beekeeper to design the structure and let the bee do the magic. And this is how I see the role of the government, the public sector in Africa. So we need to create the right enabling environment, the right policies, the right incentive, and give the private sector the space to do the magic of creating jobs and employment. Because private sector in Africa, it is 60% of GDP and 80 to 90% of job creation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Shall I could go on to add my observations?
Yes, please.
Sure. So I found the results very interesting. And I think the nice thing about Afrobarometer is that you are getting disaggregated African data and you have an opportunity to compare what's happening across the different countries because sometimes we will paint the SADC region with the same brush or West Africa looks a particular way. And I think what was valuable, particularly with the employment data, is getting a sense country by country what are the numbers saying? What are respondents actually saying? So in terms of the unemployment story, it's quite clear that unemployment is high, and that's a fact that we know. And I found the breakdown interesting to look at who is full-time employed and part-time employed. What I would have loved to see there, particularly with the part-time, is what exactly that means. Are they gig workers? Are they self-employed? Or do they actually have contracts where it says, I am part-time employed? Reason being, when comparing different African countries, how labor markets are segmented is a bit different. So how perceptions country by country regarding one's employment status differ. Then you also have the differences where someone might be part-time employed, but they also entrepreneurial or have other forms of work. And I think what's important, particularly with young people in the continent and understanding what policy levers would be valuable is understanding fully what do we mean when we say someone is part-time employed, what are the tax implications, income implications, and what does it mean for them in terms of agency as young people. So that's just the what I would have loved to see that story being painted a bit better. Then another very interesting aspect of the results was young people's perceptions about both the economic conditions as well as personal living conditions. And I think what is kind of like very common is that people do have quite pessimistic or negative perceptions regarding what's happening in their countries. And I wonder if that is based on, yes, economically, things are not going well, but could it also be a consequence of just young people not feeling like they have agency to change their situation? And I think particularly in this, narrative about the youth bulge, we're finding now that back in the day, young people knew that if I'm a teacher, my employment is secure until I retire. If I study this, my employment is secure until, but now we're in a place where even if you do have a teacher's degree, I mean, even in South Africa, some of our doctors are unemployed. Even as an educated young person, you are still at risk of not having access to income to be able to achieve basic livelihood. So I think that's the sentiment there is very sobering. But I think it's quite interesting then in that same breath when having perceptions about the future, there's a lot of optimism. And I think it would have been nice even from the presentation to hear what are some of those levers, what are some of those things that are making young people quite optimistic about, it's not that great, it could get better. The final point I wanted to talk about is the role of government. And I want to talk about our fiscus. Most country governments rely on a sustainable tax base, right? To have an income to allocate to various things such as health, infrastructure, etc., etc. But now we have a situation where young people, most of them can't get access to work. So they can't be formal taxpayers. So they can't contribute to the fiscus that is supposed to provide the basic needs such as healthcare. So I think there's also a conversation to be had about that. And I think, Joshua, you mentioned it so well, saying we actually need to look at private sector. And I think we really need to start thinking about the fact that governments are getting more and more burden, but the fiscus is getting less and less because we just don't have a tax base that actually matches the people who need government support. So I'll leave it there as, start off points, but those are just my sentiments from the results so far.
Thank you
Yes, if
both
I may
for.
just add something quickly, because I think what Sibali was saying is also quite interesting. First, in terms of the narratives, when I was kind of listening to the presentation and reviewing the presentation, I think the narratives come up quite pessimistic and negative. It really came up to me like very, very negative way. And this is something I feel like as economists we need to pay attention to because the report we publish, the article we write, uh, this is food. It is food for the policymakers and it is food for investors. When investors will consider investing in a country, they first look at what can we find in these countries, what kind of report has been published about this country. And frankly, if I am an investor and I'm considering allocating a lot of capital to a country, I wouldn't direct it to a countries where the narrative is quite pessimistic. Well, this is not to say that we should not necessarily kind of highlight the issue that we're facing. Obviously, they're very important. I think that the framing could actually sometimes change how people perceive and see African countries. And finally, on the private sector, definitely, I think it is important, right? As Bali was talking about the tax base, right? But if you look at the positive economic assessment slide of the government, I see two institutions that are expected to play a key role. The first is the Ministry of Finance and Economy for managing the economy. And the second one is the central bank for keeping price stability, right? So, but these two institutions work closely with the private sector. The Ministry of Finance and Economy will kind of raise taxes from the companies. Most of them are private sector companies. So in a way, the private sector is important because these are the ones who will create the jobs. If you create the enabling environment for them, they will be able to hire more young people, and then they will come also part of a tax base that she was mentioning. And same way for the central bank, the role of the central bank is to provide the liquidity for the economy, right? And this is usually done through the banking sector, so that these private sector companies could go to the banking sector, all right, and kind of get a loan or to invest in whatever they want to invest in. So we don't want to send the message that only the public sector should be taking care of all the issues. I think there needs to be like a partnership with the private sector. And this is why I think it is important to create the right framework for private sector.
Thank you for those enlightening answers. We also would like to hear from the people in the chat, our participants, what you all observed about the PowerPoint and what we could do to add to the polling, or if there was anything missing. We do also have a question from Mr. Bachelor. Afrobarometer data shows that many young and well-educated African youth desire to migrate in search for jobs or better economic prospects. Given this growing desire to migrate, at what broader economic or structural challenges should policymakers and stakeholders be paying attention to?
Sure. So I think, and this was mentioned during the opening remarks, is that young people on the African continent are also dealing with an underemployment problem. So even those who are employed, they have jobs, are not necessarily doing jobs which are aligned with their skill set. So an engineer could be literally a driver. So there's a huge mismatch, and young people actually want to do work that is aligned with their skills. And the prospect of migration then says, I will go to country A, B, and C because I can do what I actually studied. And that's a big one because what then it presents is that we are having this brain drain of young people going away, but we're also having them being more vulnerable to social, political, or geopolitical conditions that are outside our control. Another aspect of it is then, in this case of wanting to migrate, the question is, do young people actually have the correct information about what opportunities are available for them? And I actually attended a recent Afrobarometer event, and one of the statistics we're talking about in the context now of, the African Continental Free Trade Area and the economic opportunities which exist there. There's only about maybe 12% of young Africans who even know about AFCFTA and the opportunities that are available for them. So there's a huge misinformation or lack of information thereof regarding what does it mean to then migrate or move in a manner that actually aligns with our career prospects. But what I really want to highlight is that we're in a world now where labor markets have changed, right? There's AI jobs, there's green jobs, there's so many ways that people can transfer their existing skills into sectors that are growing even within the continent, but they don't know how to do that. And I think something for policymakers to really need to start thinking about is how do we equip young people to position themselves for roles and opportunities in sectors that are growing, that are blooming even within the African continent. I think that's an important conversation because as a career coach, even speaking to young, educated people who are in employment, there are just so many unknowns. They just don't know. They're like, oh, I'm just hoping I will just stay here, go for promotion to promotion. But there's no thought about in this changing environment where my job might be obsolete in 5 years. There's nothing about what else or where else can I lend my skills in a manner that is actually productive and will contribute to the economy and beyond. So I think in terms of then what does it mean for policymakers and strategists is that we really need to have a better or clearer conversation about what do school to work transitions look like in more dynamic industries where now when we talk about climate related jobs, and just so maybe you'll have inputs there, what are we saying about the kind of skills that are required and how young people can actually position themselves to also be valuable, hires or have the right skills that are plug and play, even in these new up and coming sectors?
Thank you for your answer. It's very interesting to hear how the governments can work with the society to enhance opportunities, especially when we see that there's renewable energy transformation, multiple countries finding oil, and even development banks are doing more investments. So, based on the findings, and this question is for Mr. Banga. What policy recommendations do you see as the most urgent for governments across the continent to build off of Ms. Magala's answer?
No, definitely. Thank you for the questions. Obviously, based on the findings, one cannot argue more than to say that, government need to invest in health, because health show up as the most important issues that government need to address. And the second one will be education and infrastructure, right? So, and definitely based on the finding of a survey, I would tell government, this is what you need to prioritize. But here is the point. Take, for example, infrastructure, right? If you want to build an infrastructure, whether it is a health infrastructure, energy infrastructure, transport infrastructure, education infrastructure, you need at least three things. The first one is the skill that Sibali was talking about. So you need people with the right skills who can build that infrastructure. The second one, you need the capital, right? And the third one, you need the technology for that infrastructure. So I will add that, government also need to invest a lot in I would say in STEM education. And STEM education stands for science, engineering, technology, and mathematics. The world is becoming increasingly digital and technological driven. So Africa future is technology. So we need to invest massively in that. And I think it is also that will also help boost productivity, because when people have the right skill, they can actually increase their productivity and earn more money. Definitely, I will say this will be a priority. The other thing I think it is important, which is more like a long-term visions, is for African government to think of prioritizing, I would say, long-term asset for the citizen. And by long-term assets, I mean, for example, it can be like a home, lands, or stocks, that you can do some reform that will enable the majority. Obviously, not everyone will be able to afford it, but when you provide those assets to the majority of your citizens, you create stability and I would say a window for long-term growth. And this is really important for government to prioritize that. For example, if you take many African countries, we are so rich in many natural resources. And sometimes what you can do is to create those national companies specializes in these natural resources, and instead of selling all the shares, all the share of this company to foreign companies or international investors, you find the right balance where you prioritize citizens, When the economy is doing well, when the economy is growing, when these companies are doing well, it means that the whole nation is becoming richer and richer and richer. So these are some of the policy that I think government need to prioritize. At the same time, when you give people land, access to land and home, they can use it as a collateral that they can use to access other services, whether it is access to finance or other forms of credit, and then take care of their own health. Health is important, but here is the point. Health is not a one-time off investment that you do, and it is guaranteed for life. This is something that, at the individual level, you need to have the assets that will help you or allow you to take care of your health over the time. So
Thank you. Yes, we should definitely prioritize health, education, and infrastructure, policy surrounding skills development and finance. Um, I do believe long-term planning is key. As we have seen, it can help stabilize different countries within just a few decades. And an example being land reform, which is a big key issue in many countries. And with that, we will open up the Q&A. I see we do have a few questions here from the audience. And the first one is, if the private sector is going to be the conduit for economic success on the continent, how do we prevent an extractive environment where profits are taken to the UK, US, or France?
um, Thank you. I don't know who asked the question. So,
Oh, yes,
but
it's a Hugh Goffinet.
thanks a lot for the question. So, I think it is important to make a clear distinction when I'm talking about the private sector. I'm not necessarily talking about the international private sector. Right? I'm also talking about the domestic private sector. This is the one we need to develop, and this is the one that will be the driver of growth, the engine of growth and job creation. So we need to create the environment to unlock the potential of a domestic private sector. Obviously, we will always need to develop partnership with international, private company that have a lot of experience and capital. But the strategy should be focused on developing the domestic private sector, not necessarily the international private sector, who, they come for profit and it is normal for them to exploit whatever they can exploit and take it back home. But we need to focus on developing the domestic private sector. That's what I was referring to.
Yeah, and may I add to that because I think it's a very important question, because African countries do find themselves, I call it debt slavery, as a consequence of leaning on, international, investment. And I think what we are seeing now is that there are African-owned, capital and private equity firms such as, Afrexim Bank, which is investing in infrastructure, particularly supporting young people, entrepreneurs to build, whether they're creatives or people who have, farms or want to push their agribusiness industries in their countries, right? We also see institutions like Partech Africa that's investing, millions into African tech startups. So I think just to back up, just so that these sources exist, and I think we need to tap into them more in terms of developing African economies.
Thank you for those answers. They were very insightful. Osman Bakali asked, with African governments prioritizing consumption over production, ballooning debt, rising taxes, corruption, and flawed policies, what economic future does the youth on the continent realistically have?
Do you mind repeating the question, please?
With African governments prioritizing consumption over production, ballooning
Mm.
debt, rising taxes, corruption, and flawed policies, what economic future does the youth on the continent realistically have?
It's an important question, Osman, right? I think as a government, you need to have the right trade-off. There are priority short-term needs that you need to meet. Obviously, as a government, you need to do that. But I will argue that if you really want or serious about creating the long-term economic growth and stability for your economy, you need to prioritize more on the production side, and especially the domestic transformation of your resources, because when you are consuming, and most of the consumption usually is imported, it's not like the consumption that is produced locally. So that is the problem, right? Because when you are able to produce locally and then meet your consumption demand. So that not bad thing. But like when as a nation you are consuming a lot, but that consumption is coming from abroad, right? So it means like the amount of money you have, you are just taking it and then giving it to other countries. So we need to I would say advise government on developing the domestic production system. And again, it goes back to the private sector because we know that if we want to develop to do that, you need a dynamic and vibrant private sector to be able to produce the goods and services that the people, the citizen in that country consume. So when you are able to kind of produce domestically and consume domestically and then export, I think definitely you are heading to the right direction.
Okay. And we will take a couple of questions at this time. Mario Sanchez from Cabo Verde, thank thanks you for attending this meeting and asked the question based on evidence gathered across the continent. What do you identify as the single most critical bottleneck that systemically prevents African youth from transforming their skills into real prosperity, whether in education, health, or economic life? What type of policy shift or institutional reform will have the greatest impact in unlocking this potential over the next decade? And the second question is, we shouldn't look only at macroeconomic issues, but microeconomic issues. The youth need to be empowered and educated on these different topics. So the question is, did we take into account the size of the country? Is it that densely populated countries are those that are more pessimistic and as opposed to smaller countries?
Mhm. I'll take a first stab at it. I think in terms of the bottlenecks, it's so difficult to just say there's one bottleneck that is, hampering, growth. But what I do want to say that particularly for young people in this age of social media and access to information from a mobile phone, whether you live in a rural or urban area, I think what the key need is for young people is agency, right? The ability to say, if I want socio-economic mobility for myself, I can leverage my education, but I can also leverage access to capital to start a business, sustain it, and build wealth. Unfortunately, in our countries, that is not available unless you are connected politically or you have, a wealthy friend. Outside of that, it's just not feasible. So I'd say the key bottleneck is that they are just the levers for socioeconomic mobility are just broken. Education doesn't work anymore because you're not guaranteed to get a job. Even as a young person hustling, trying to, start a business, you're not guaranteed access to capital or maybe being part of an accelerator program or incubator program to get you from startup to actually a business that's functioning. And so we can't say that's just a function of one bottleneck. Government is an issue. I think there's infrastructure, there's many other things. But I do want to say for young people, what I am seeing, particularly as a career coach, is that they are starting to say that they can no longer depend on government anymore, right? We are the ones we need, and what can we leverage in order to do that? What I wanted to mention earlier on is that in some African countries, what we do see, particularly in the context of getting capital for business, is that young people are also starting to lean on remittances from the diaspora. So Africans abroad sending money. So instead of just consuming that money just for food or supplies, they are now leveraging it to actually invest in their businesses and to create value. Then, in terms of the long run, when I think of the African continent, and I speak as a South African, we just had our G20. South Africa hosted the G20 this year. I think what we're starting to have discussions about more and more is that African countries actually need to lean on each other for the cause or the purpose of development. I spoke about African Continental Free Trade Area, but even thinking about the capital pools, right? And how we actually sit as African countries to agree on these are the resources that country A has. This is, the financing country B is. This is how we can partner together and even provide financing at rates that are fair and actually embody the principles of Ubuntu, not extraction, but Ubuntu, which says I am because you are. That's a way. But I think it's a mindset thing. I think even as Africans, how we view each other and what Ghana produces versus what South Africa or Malawi produces, I think we need to actually have a mutual and a common respect for the value and the capabilities that we have and also partner from that area. And I think young people are starting to have those conversations, but I think now the bottleneck is feeling like, do I have the agency to move from just theorizing about the potential of African partnerships, but what does it look like for me as an individual with my degree or business owner to actually make that an actionable thing? So case in point, as someone who is in agribusiness and I'm a young person, what does it look like then to trade some of my supplies to another African country? And I think then the bottleneck there is what does a growth path look like? And I think young people do need to be empowered with the support, the information, the resources to achieve that. So the answer to just close of the bottlenecks are many, but I think what we're trying to say is that Africans now are in a position where we are saying whether government is doing what they need to do or not, we are also wanting to take more active agency of our lives because the situations and circumstances just, require us to do so.
Yes, and just to add to what Shibali has powerfully, stated, I think at the micro level, what Sibalis and others are doing, I think it is important to kind of duplicate this kind of example, and I would call it maybe a mentoring program for young African. I think it is super important. The fact is that exposure does matter. When you get exposed to a certain environment, your belief system changes. So I think it is important for us to develop a mentoring program for young Africans, whereby they will be paired with successful entrepreneurs, successful businesswomen and men on the continent, even with successful political leaders, and help them understand what it means like to create and manage a successful business. So that exposure is what will create the ecosystem, and it's like a mindset shift, I would say. And if you look at, I usually joke with my friend that if you take a kid and you send them to the UK to study English, but in 5 years, the way they will speak like the Britain themselves. Why? Because they have been exposed to that environment. So your immediate circle, your immediate network usually affect how you see things. So that's why I think it is really critical to develop these mentoring program that will help open up the eyes of many young Africans and tell that there are many opportunities on the continent. And I'm telling you that because you have successful entrepreneurs on the continent who will never think of 1 second of migrating because they know that the future is Africa. So why exit the future and go in the past? It doesn't make sense. So we need to really develop that a lot. Again, I would say in our education system, we may need to revamp it a little bit because today, if we take out someone from West Francophone Africa, they know little about Southern Africa education system, for example, or even difficult for them to go to a university in Southern Africa and do exchange program and learn something about the country. So maybe the people at the top know each other, but the people on the bottom, we don't know each other a lot. And it is like by collaborating that sometimes you can develop a transformative idea and create that ecosystem. So I feel like this is also something that we may need to pay attention going forward.
Thank you. The next question is, in the report, did we take into account the size of the countries? Is that densely populated? Are those densely populated countries more pessimistic as opposed to smaller countries? So I think that's more of a question for Afrobarometer.
Thank you. So the way we work, and remember when I was talking about methodology, I said that we usually work with the National Statistical Service to ensure that our surveys are nationally representative. And so, let me give this analogy. It's like when you are preparing soup, you don't have to drink the entire soup to know how tasty it is. You just really stir it well, and then you take a little proportion, and it gives you a reflection of what the entire soup will taste like. Or when you have to do a blood test, you just take a sample, and it sort of reflects what's happening in your body. And so we go through really stringent protocols to ensure that our surveys are nationally representative. And so with a sample size of plus or minus 200 in some countries, or 2004, sample size of 1,200 or 2,400, we're able to tell, we're able to give very nationally representative data. And like I said, the margin of error is usually plus or minus 2 percentage points. That means that if you really go through the protocols, and we have our manual available on the website, so you can actually, replicate everything that we did. there's a likelihood that there's a 95% likelihood that you're going to get the same responses, or a margin of error of plus or minus 2 or 3 percentage points. And so it's not really about the size. So for instance, we wouldn't say that for a country like Nigeria, I mean, we can't really use the sizes and the proportion of people that we spoke to really tell. You could look ask the why questions, and so we just make the data available as it is, and then we encourage the experts, and that's the reason why we're having some of these conversations, so that they help us know some of the nuances behind the numbers.
Another question is, for inter-regional mobility, the ratification of the African Union's Free Movement Protocol will provide the necessary space for young people to move around freely and work. Does Afrobarometer look at any bilateral agreements or sub-regional mobility zones that demonstrate opportunity for the Free Movement Protocol to propel forward? And then the next question, oh, that was by Patty Kunson. And then the next question is, what role or roles can civil society play in working with governments and the private sector in addressing the issues highlighted in the findings by an anonymous attendee?
I think the first question is for Afrobarometer, so we'll let
Yeah.
them
So I'll address the question directed to Afrobarometer. We do, I hope you can hear me. We do, in our most recent round of surveys, we included questions on, globalism, so Africa in the world. And one of the key sections that we have is a set of questions on the, for instance, but also people's views on international trade, whether we should allow for free trade, or we should have some restrictions to protect local organizations. We also have findings on even crossing borders to work, how difficult it is, how easy it is, and what people think about it. We also have data on people's views on immigration, and so people coming into the country to work, and also people's views on refugees, and some other international relations related findings. Let me give you a teaser. We're actually working on a flagship report which will be launched next year, and it's basically going to be looking at some of these findings. And so please sign on to our mailing list, and then just look out for these findings. When they're ready, we'll definitely organize some of these webinars again to discuss them with you.
And then for the second question, what role or roles can civil society play in working with government and the private sector in addressing the issues highlighted in the findings?
You may go first, Sibeli.
So I think the role, I mean, when I think of civic society, right, that's the bedrock of democracy, right? And I think civic society has a role in amplifying citizens' voices, but also providing them with the information required to understand what their rights and their access look like in a changing both geopolitical but economic environment. I think civil society in partnership with government and private sector should be, the institutions or the people that demand accountability in this co-creation of change to include more young people and women in the mainstream economy. I also believe that there's a role for civil society, particularly when thinking about, access to financing, funding youth, initiatives, women's collectives, and, advocacy platforms for young people who are in the creative sector. I believe that, civil society plays a role in lobbying and promoting those initiatives. And I mean, I use an example. I think of, the collective that I've co-founded with my partner, the Careers Collective. We are empowering African youth, right, to really be active agents when it comes to their careers. But we do that, but by also partnering with private sector and other institutions to really support just more inclusivity of young people and also giving them a voice and the right mindset to know how to navigate this very dynamic labor market.
Okay. Okay. In addition to the structural constraints faced by African youth, it is essential to highlight the future of the continent also depends on strengthening the democratic institutions, security, and ensuring political stability. Young people are often excluded from this process, and Africa risks building policies that do not reflect its own demographic reality. The question is, what is the single most effective action that governments and institutions can take today to ensure that youth are not just observers, but real drivers of political, economic, and social transformation across the continent?
Quick comment. I think it goes back to what my colleagues were saying in a minute ago. I think, for democracy and security, civil society actors can play a key role. The government can lay out the general frameworks, but the implementation of these frameworks usually rely on the local communities, and the civil society actors who are in touch with the local communities. But I think like civil society actors can play a key role in strengthening democratic institutions and also ensuring security on the continent, because we know that security is vital. Without security, difficult to attract investment. And sometimes when you attract those investment in an insecure, with a country with a lot of insecurity, those investment are not benefiting the people. They're benefiting the people who exploited the natural resources you have. So yes, I feel like this should be like a priority, and civil society actors have a key role to play in kind of making sure that we have democratic system in place, democratic rule in place to allow the participation of everyone in the stake of the countries.
The next questions are, is there a collective solution that can work almost for all young people in African countries to improve their economic status despite their backgrounds? And how can PPP be a part of this solution? Public-private partnerships.
Yeah, I mean, public-private partnership is for me a key pillar of what we're talking about, the role of the private sector. And the partnership need to be smart, because usually in the past we have had a lot of PPP experiences where, the government ended up paying more than they should, right? So it part of what I was calling the beekeeper role. As a beekeeper, it is really your role in designing your beehives to make sure that the bee will not exit the beehive and try to make the honey outside. So that means having the strong institutions in place, having the strong regulatory framework in place, having the right incentive in place, that will kind of create the enabling environment for the private sector to play their role. So this is definitely what I think should be done to allow a profitable PPP for African countries.
I always love to use South Africa's citrus sector as a nice case study for that, because our citrus, we export to Europe, we export globally. And how that worked is that, both black and white farmers came together almost like as a cooperative to kind of start to produce, citrus goods, oranges at the scale required for export, number one. But they then got support from government to kind of then get right what they need to be able to export, but also private sector played a role, particularly when it came to meeting the sanitary and phytosanitary standards that are required to actually export agricultural goods globally. And then another layer was that when you're exporting, you need the right packaging and branding to be competitive globally. And that was also then a PPP thing because you have different, stakeholders and role players in making that happen. And I always think about even when I was in the UK studying, seeing South African oranges or South African goods is just like, it just shows that it can work if people do come together, with aligned interests and want to make it work.
The next, before we continue, please don't forget to follow the link to in the chat that Afrobarometer put down so that you can stay up to date with the latest findings and the LinkedIn group. The next question is, what specific role do you see for African diaspora on and off the continent in the private sector, players in their countries of origin, or other continent countries on the continent, as well as advocate for better economic conditions for young people? The second question is from David from Uganda. There is a significant age gap between African leaders and the continent's young population. The aspirations between the two groups differ greatly in power, given the disconnect. How can the government change unemployment and create an enabling environment for the private sector, which is essential for job creation? And then the last question is, how far can the green economy find its way on the African continent in order to promote sustainable development?
Yeah, maybe one quick comment on the role of the diaspora. I think that's important. The diaspora, I see two main roles for the diaspora. One is knowledge. The diaspora can take knowledge from where they are, whether it is in Europe, North America, or Asia. They can bring back knowledge that can help, develop a specific sector in Africa. And the other role is the capital. We know that, the diaspora transfer a lot of money, every year to the family or to support businesses. I think we need to develop a strategy around that and see how we can channel those resources into more productive sector and help unlock the potential of specific sector in Africa.
Could you repeat the other two questions?
Yes. David from Uganda says there's a significant age gap between the African leaders and the continent's young population, and given this disconnect, is there a genuine political will to address challenges such as unemployment and enabling an environment for the private sector to thrive? And then the third question is, how far can the green economy find its way on the African continent in order to promote sustainable development?
Oh, I think on the topic of youth leadership I think what it requires is that young people just need to take up space and force matters. But I also do want to say that there are, civil society or kind of independent organizations such as Future Elect, which I was part of, that is empowering the next generation of political leaders. And young people are literally trained or almost like prepared for what it means to be a public servant in government. How do you prepare yourself mentally, emotionally, and otherwise to actually lead and serve in that space and actually be able to navigate the challenges that come with it? Because I think to lead in government, in political arenas, is not just about intelligence. There's other factors that are there. And I think then the role of civil society also becomes, important to mentor and promote the next generation of young people who not only take up the space, but actually sustain that space. In terms of green jobs, maybe Joshua will have a lot to say, but I think one thing about the green economy is that it requires a lot of infrastructure investment. It also requires then knowing what are the component parts, right? So if we're saying it's a hydro project, what does that mean? What are the component parts? And then how do we make young people understand where they can actually fit into that value chain. So we actually need to start thinking about renewables energy, climate jobs, or even opportunities in this age of the just transition, and break it down into its component parts to understand who does what, who owns what the value chain looks like, and where young people, based on their skills, can actually plug in and fit in and add value there, and also benefit as a consequence.
Yes, and on the green economy, thank you for the person who asked the question. I think Africa has a lot of potential when it comes to the green economy. And sometimes I think there is a lot of misunderstanding or miscommunication around the green economy that people don't always understand the potential that exists there. If you look at today, the majority of African continent, for example, they do have, I would say, comparative advantage in developing, for example, renewable energy, right? So obviously, you need to be strategic, because recently what we have seen is that the dialogue on climate and everything has kind of gone wild, and it become only about emission reduction. And this is not, in my opinion, as a climate finance specialist, fair. We need to find the right narrative when it comes to that energy transitions. Obviously, there are countries for which it makes a lot of sense to invest in green energy. Why? Because if you look at the budget, they spent billions of US dollar for importing fossil fuel, while they could develop renewable energy and reduce the deficit, the external deficit. This is something that, a lot of government don't pay attention to. And in Africa, you have countries like Angola, or Algeria or Nigeria, who depend a lot on fossil fuel. So in these countries, it doesn't mean that they cannot invest in green, right? But you, as a policymakers, because energy is vital. Without energy, you cannot achieve any meaningful development. So you need to strike the right balance in terms of, does it make sense for me to continue importing, for example, or in addition to my production that I have on fossil fuel, how can I increase my energy mix so that, if there are some market shocks, at least, I know that in terms of energy supply, I will be able to have something to back up. So this is something that a lot of government need to consider. The other dimension is the whole business opportunity that exists in the green economy. If you look at job creations, green job creation, it has gone exponential over the past 10 years, exponential, especially on renewable energy, solar, etc. So, and we see that Africa has a lot of potential to develop this. And countries in Asia have also done this. And sometimes what that means is investing in things that are sometimes very simple, but it can create a lot of jobs for people. And I want here to take the example of Singapore, for example. Singapore doesn't have enough resources. But if you read the book of Lee Kuan Yew, the father of Singapore, he will tell you that green investment was the cheapest and the most effective investment he has done to create jobs and also attract investment in Singapore. He said when he invested in greening Singapore, when investors come, they were amazed. They said, oh, this country is so beautiful. And all investors, all the quality investors wanted to come and settle in Singapore and do their business in Singapore because it has provided a good quality of life to the people. And the green investment has made the country just beautiful, that everyone just wanted to live and do business in Singapore. So this is something that I think our government need to consider and know that when you invest in green, you can attract quality investment in your country. If your country is so rich, right, in natural resources, let's say, I don't know, oil, for example, but it doesn't provide the quality of life, and it's polluted and everything is not organized. So when investors come there, the priority is to take whatever they can take and go out because they don't want to live there. But when you create the kind of a greenery of the system, the greenery of your countries, when everyone visit and they see it, it's like, okay, this is a nice place and I want to do business in this country. So this is how people will be seeing the green transition and the green investment in Africa, and make sure that we make Africa the greenest continent, I would say, in the world.
Thank you to our panelists for these responses. We have other questions. However, we are running out of time. Therefore, that brings us to the end of this enriching webinar on improving economic conditions for African youth. If your question did not get answered today, please post them with the hashtags on social media, with the hashtags that's on the screen, and or reach out to us and we will do our best to address them. Some key takeaways that I have gathered from this discussion was that government policies will be instrumental in improving the infrastructure of the job markets, and this type of government action is widely encouraged by the youth. Private sector will play a key role in the development of opportunities, and the citizens, especially the youth, can have the domestic economy greatly developed with these partnerships. There are many actors working towards developing a thriving atmosphere for job growth, and we must stabilize by balancing short-term growth and long-term planning, promoting youth agency, health, education, and addressing the blockages in the process for transformation. As we have seen from Afrobarometers and the World Bank datasets, unemployment does remain a persistent issue that must be addressed. We have also heard from our panelists about the importance of addressing the private sector and policy-based engagement as productive tools for development. We do send the biggest thank you to our organizers at Afrobarometer and the Think Africa Partnerships Economists for Transformation program. For our panelists, if you have any contacts, if you would like to share, please feel free to share them in the chat or just share them after the call. And should you need to reference this webinar, you will be able to find this webinar on YouTube. Thank you to our global audience for attending this webinar, and we look forward to engaging with you online and during future events. And for everyone, please enjoy the rest of your day, evening, and or night. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.